Have you ever wondered how soldiers slept in frozen trenches? Now, I'll tell you the truth, and it will shock you. Winter on the front lines was not just a season, but a full-fledged weapon of mass destruction. It made no distinction between friend and foe, methodically sapping the strength of everyone who found themselves in its icy embrace. When the temperature dropped below 30 degrees, a soldier's main task was not to carry out orders, but simply to survive until dawn. These inhuman conditions gave rise to remarkable ingenuity, turning trash and improvised tools into instruments of salvation. Heroism was evident not only in the roar of battle, but also in the quiet, exhausting struggle against the cold, where ingenuity became the main weapon. This is a story about how soldiers slept in frozen trenches and what secrets helped them see another day. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn why old newspapers were worth their weight in gold, and how ordinary snow could become a freezing soldier's best friend. What if I told you that a soldier's main enemy in the trenches was not a sniper, but the deafening silence of a winter night? It was in this silence that the cold transformed from a physical factor into a psychological weapon. It penetrated not only under the greatcoat, but also into the consciousness, slowly sucking out the will to live. Every soldier fought his own personal battle with this invisible enemy. The struggle was to not allow himself to succumb to apathy and drowsiness, which were precursors to freezing. This required enormous inner tension and self-control. The veterans knew that the main danger was to stop moving. Therefore, even in moments of calm, the soldiers tried to move around, shift from foot to foot, and rub their hands. Any movement was a small victory over the icy numbness. The cold distorted their perception of time, stretching the night hours into infinity. The minutes of waiting for dawn seemed like an eternity. It was a test, not so much for the body as for the spirit. Many soldiers recalled that the most frightening thing was the feeling of loneliness in the face of this element. Even standing shoulder to shoulder with their comrades, each remained alone with the piercing cold. This battle took place inside each person. Experienced fighters tried to occupy their minds with anything to keep from thinking about the cold. They remembered home, mentally retold books, or simply counted to 1,000. It was a form of meditation, a way to stay sane. For young recruits, their first winter on the front lines was a shock. They were not prepared for the cold to be so pervasive and relentless. Their survival depended directly on the advice and help of their older comrades. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think was harder for a soldier, fighting a visible enemy or an invisible one like the cold? Write about it in the comments. Are you ready to learn the truth about how the ground itself became an icy trap? A soldier's first refuge was a trench, but in winter it turned from a shelter from bullets into an icy trap. The frozen ground gave off cold, and the walls, saturated with moisture, were covered with a crust of ice. Building a more reliable shelter, an earthen hut or dugout, became a priority. Digging frozen ground was a titanic task. Soldiers used not only shovels but also pickaxes, crowbars, and even explosives to break through the rock-hard ground. The ideal dugout was 1.5 to 2 meters deep. This allowed the soldiers to use the heat of the earth and protected them from the wind and shrapnel. A pit that was too deep risked being flooded by groundwater, while one that was too shallow froze through. The walls were the most vulnerable place for cold to penetrate. They tried to reinforce and insulate them with whatever they could find. They used boards from ammunition boxes, branches, poles, and any other wood materials. They tried to create an air gap between the wooden cladding and the earthen wall. This simple technique significantly reduced heat loss. Air itself is an excellent insulator. Straw was considered the best insulator. It was used to fill the space behind the paneling, cover the floor, and even cover the roof. Straw not only retained heat well, but also absorbed excess moisture, making the air in the dugout drier. The roof, or nakat, was made of several layers of logs. It was covered with a thick layer of earth, which camouflaged the shelter and served as additional insulation. In winter, this earthen roof was covered with snow, which turned it into an almost impenetrable armor against the cold. Inside, the dugout was a very cramped space. The entire space was occupied by bunks made of planks or poles. Soldiers slept huddled together, pressing against each other to conserve precious heat. The entrance to the dugout was always a problem. To prevent cold air from rushing in, it was covered with several layers of raincoats or old blankets. This created a kind of vestibule that blocked the frost. A properly constructed dugout could maintain a positive temperature inside even in severe frosts, using only the body heat of the people living in it. It was a primitive but incredibly effective engineering structure. But what if I told you that the soldiers' main ally in the fight against the cold was their worst enemy? Snow? Read on to the next chapter to learn about this amazing secret. I will reveal the best-kept secret of survival in the snow that you definitely did not know about. For the uninitiated, snow is synonymous with cold, but soldiers on the front lines quickly realized its paradoxical property. Snow is one of the best natural insulators. The secret lies in its structure. Freshly fallen snow is 90–95% air trapped between ice crystals. It is this immobile air that prevents heat from escaping. Soldiers actively use this property to insulate their shelters. The walls of trenches and dugouts were deliberately covered with a thick layer of snow. This snow coat provided reliable protection from the biting wind. Moreover, the soldiers dug entire snow caves, or foxholes, in deep snowdrifts. Such a shelter could be dug in an hour or two, and it was much warmer than an open trench. Inside the snow cave, the temperature rarely dropped below zero, even when it was bitterly cold outside. Snow was also used to camouflage and insulate individual firing positions. The soldier simply piled up a high parapet of snow around himself. This not only hid him from the enemy's view, but also protected him from the wind. Experienced scouts going on a raid for several days did not take tents with them. They settled down for the night right in a snowdrift, digging a small depression for themselves. They covered themselves with a raincoat, which they sprinkled with snow. This method required certain skills. The entrance to the snow shelter was always made below the level of the bed, so that warm air would not escape, and a small hole was always made in the ceiling for ventilation. The ability to use snow to their advantage separated the survivors from those who succumbed to the cold. It was the highest level of soldierly ingenuity. What you are about to learn will make you look at your winter wardrobe in a different light. No dugout, even the warmest one, could save a soldier if his clothing was not suitable for the conditions. Standard uniforms were often not warm enough for extreme cold. The main principle of survival was layering. Soldiers intuitively, or through the experience of their senior comrades, understood that several thin layers of clothing kept them warmer than one thick layer. The air pockets between the layers provided additional insulation. The bottom layer was underwear. Red Army soldiers were issued warm winter underwear made of baize. The Allies used underwear made of a cotton and wool blend, which wicks away moisture well. A gymnastica shirt and trousers were worn over the underwear. In winter, they were supplemented with quilted cotton trousers and a telogreika, or vatnik. This simple and inexpensive clothing proved to be surprisingly effective and became a true symbol of the Soviet soldier. American and British soldiers received warm wool sweaters and jackets with fur or cloth lining. Flight jackets, which were designed for cold weather at high altitudes, were especially prized. Getting one of these jackets was considered a great stroke of luck. The top layer was a greatcoat or a short fur coat. The greatcoat protected against wind and snow, but in severe frost, it was not enough on its own. Guards on duty were additionally given sheepskin coats, which were virtually impervious to the cold. Special attention was paid to protecting the feet, hands, and head. Woolen socks or foot cloths, warm gloves or mittens, and a fur hat with ear flaps were essential items. Losing any of these items could have serious consequences. Soldiers showed remarkable ingenuity in keeping warm. They put old newspapers under their greatcoats. Paper does not conduct heat well and protects from the wind. Shoes were insulated with additional insoles made of straw or dry grass. Clothing was like a second skin for a soldier, his personal fortress. What do you think was the most important element of winter uniform for survival? In the next chapter, you will learn how a simple piece of canvas could replace a soldier's tent and blanket. The Soviet raincoat tent was a model of ingenious simplicity and versatility. This ordinary piece of canvas, measuring 180 by 180 centimeters, was a real lifesaver for soldiers. It was developed back in the Tsarist army and remained virtually unchanged until the end of World War II. First and foremost, it served as individual protection from the weather. A rifle could be inserted into the arm slits, turning the tent into a kind of poncho that protected against rain and wet snow. The canvas was impregnated with a special water-repellent compound, but its main advantage was revealed when used together. There were special eyelets and wooden buttons along the edges of the fabric. This allowed several poncho tents to be joined together to create shelters of different sizes. 2 sheets could be used to make a simple gable tent that could shelter 2 or 3 soldiers. 4 sheets could be used to build a full-fledged 4-person tent, and 6 sheets could be used to make a spacious tent for an entire platoon. These shelters were indispensable during marches or at temporary positions. They could be set up in a matter of minutes and provided at least some protection from wind and precipitation. Under such a canopy, it was possible to build a small fire or set up a trench candle. The raincoat tent also served as a bedding for sleeping in a dugout or trench. Spread out on the floor, it protected against dampness coming from the ground. Soldiers often stuffed it with straw or hay to make an improvised mattress. They also used it as a blanket to cover themselves. The canvas itself did not provide warmth, but it blocked the wind and retained the heat emitted by the body. Soldiers often used it as a cover. Each soldier received his own raincoat tent and carried it rolled up over his shoulder. It was not just a piece of equipment, but a guarantee of survival. Losing a raincoat tent at the front was equivalent to losing a weapon. Are you ready for the shocking truth about how soldiers kept warm? Any shelter remained cold without a source of fire, but building a fire on the front line was deadly dangerous. Smoke and light revealed the position, immediately attracting enemy fire. The solution was the so-called bourgeois, small metal stoves. They were made in rear workshops or directly at the front from materials at hand. An empty barrel, a canister, or even several steel sheets welded together could serve as a base. Such a stove heated up quickly and gave off a lot of heat. It could be used to boil tea, heat up canned food, and dry clothes. The chimney was let outside through a special hole in the roof of the dugout. The main problem was fuel. Firewood was in short supply in the barren steppe or on the cratered field. Entire expeditions had to be sent to the nearest forest to collect it, risking coming under fire. Therefore, anything that could burn was used. They used boards from broken boxes, wooden parts of weapons, and the remains of fortifications. Sometimes even coal collected from wrecked locomotives was used as fuel. When even that was unavailable, soldiers resorted to makeshift inventions. One of them was the trench candle. It was made from a tin can, into which a strip of cardboard was tightly twisted and filled with paraffin or fat. Such a device burned for a long time, almost without smoke, and provided a little heat and light. Several such candles could slightly raise the temperature in a cramped dugout. It was a safe and affordable source of local heating. How much do you think modern life would change if we had to obtain heat in such ways? In the next chapter, we will learn what served as beds for soldiers in their icy homes. After a hard day spent in the cold, soldiers dreamed of only one thing: sleep. But it was impossible to sleep on the frozen ground or bare bunks. Therefore, preparing a place to sleep became an important daily task. Straw was the ideal bedding. It served as an excellent insulator, blocking the cold coming from the ground. A thick layer of straw laid on the bunks turned them into something like a soft and warm feather bed. Straw could be obtained from the nearest abandoned village. Special teams were sent to collect it, as well as firewood. The straw was brought back in sacks and carefully distributed among all the dugouts. When there was no straw, fir or pine branches were used. Laid in several layers, they also created a springy and warm bedding. In addition, the needles gave off a pleasant resinous smell, which masked other, less pleasant smells of military life. In wooded areas, dry leaves or moss were used. Soldiers stuffed pillowcases or simply large bags with them. This resulted in improvised mattresses, which were much more comfortable to sleep on. In steppe areas, they had to make do with dry grass or reeds. Any dry organic material was better than bare ground. The main thing was to carefully check it for thorns and sharp stems. A raincoat was spread on top of this feather bed to protect against dampness. An overcoat served as a blanket. Often, two soldiers would share one overcoat to keep warmer. Instead of a pillow, they used a duffel bag stuffed with soft items or simply a rolled-up quilt. Some put a log wrapped in cloth under their heads. Despite all these tricks, a soldier's sleep was restless and sensitive. He slept without taking off his clothes and keeping his weapon close at hand. Even in his sleep, he remained on guard. In the extreme conditions of the cold front, survival alone was virtually impossible. The main source of warmth that could not be manufactured or found was the warmth of another person. Frontline camaraderie had not only a moral, but also a very physical dimension. In cramped dugouts, soldiers slept huddled together, pressed tightly against each other. This method, known as spooning, minimized heat loss for everyone. It was warmest in the center of such a pile, so they constantly changed places. This collective sleep was the only way to survive, particularly frosty nights. The soldiers literally breathed on each other's necks, warming the space under their shared shelter with their exhaled air. It was a forced intimacy that erased all personal boundaries. Even in combat positions in open trenches, the fighters tried to stay together. 2 or 3 soldiers, sheltered by a single raincoat or blanket, had a better chance of not freezing than one. They sat back to back to protect themselves from the wind on all sides. It was especially hard for the sentries on duty. They could not sleep and had to remain alert. To keep from freezing, they were relieved every hour or two, and sometimes more often. Returning from his post, a soldier frozen to the bone could count on the help of his comrades. They rubbed him down, gave him hot tea if they had any, and put him in the warmest place. It was an unwritten law of frontline brotherhood. The same principle applied during marches. If someone began to fall behind and freeze, they were placed in the middle of the column. Their comrades supported them under the arms, preventing them from falling and helping them to move. Mutual assistance was also evident in small things. Soldiers shared dry socks, tobacco, and the last piece of sugar. These simple gestures of support helped to preserve faith in humanity amid the surrounding horror. Psychological support was no less important. Conversation, jokes, stories, all of this distracted from the cold and despair. A sense of camaraderie helped them endure what would have been impossible to bear alone. The joint struggle against the cold united people more strongly than any order. They were not just colleagues, but members of one family, bound by a common destiny. In this icy hell, they could only survive together. Cold was not the only enemy of a soldier in the trenches. Its constant and insidious companion was dampness. The fight against it was as exhausting and important as the fight against the frost. There were many sources of moisture. These included melting snow, rain during thaws, and groundwater seeping through the walls of dugouts. The trenches were almost always filled with water mixed with mud. Wet clothes and shoes in the cold were deadly dangerous. Water, freezing in the fabric, not only stopped warming, but also began to actively take heat away from the body. Keeping things dry was a top priority. Any available heat source was used to dry clothes. Socks and foot cloths were dried on stoves, at the risk of burning them. Often they were simply worn under a shirt, drying them with the heat of the body. Footwear was the biggest problem. Leather boots quickly got wet, and it was almost impossible to dry them in the field. To protect their feet in some way, soldiers smeared their boots with any available grease or tar. Condensation was another source of dampness. In a heated dugout, The warm, moist air from people's breath came into contact with the cold walls and ceiling. Moisture settled on them and dripped down onto the soldiers. The dampness ruined not only their belongings, but also their food. Crackers became moldy, and salt and sugar turned into lumps. Tobacco became damp, which was a real tragedy for smokers.
Oh, come on.
Even weapons suffered from moisture. Metal parts rusted and wooden parts swelled. Every soldier knew that after duty in wet weather, weapons had to be cleaned and lubricated immediately. Fighting dampness required constant effort. Water was scooped out of dugouts and wooden planks were laid on the floor so that people would not have to walk in the mud. Ventilation was vital, but it allowed precious heat to escape. This constant dampness, combined with the cold, created ideal conditions for disease. Colds and more serious illnesses were commonplace. Staying healthy in such conditions was a real feat. Dawn in a winter trench brought no relief. It merely replaced darkness and cold with gray light and more cold. Morning was the time when the effects of the night's battle with the frost became particularly apparent. Waking up was difficult. The body, stiff from sleeping in an uncomfortable position, was slow to obey. The first thing to do was to stretch out the frozen limbs and restore blood circulation. Everything around was covered with frost. The walls of the dugout, weapons, greatcoats, everything was white with frost. Exhaled steam instantly settled on the mustache and collar, turning into an icy crust. Putting on cold, often damp clothes was a real challenge, but the most painful thing was to squeeze his feet into frozen, stiff boots. Sometimes they had to be warmed up by the stove before he could get into them. Breakfast, if there was any, consisted of frozen bread or crackers and a mug of boiling water. Sometimes they managed to get a little porridge or canned food. Hot food was not just food, but medicine that warmed them from the inside. After breakfast, the daily routine began. Cleaning weapons, checking posts, digging trenches. Any physical work helped to keep warm, so the soldiers set about it with particular zeal. The morning was a time to take stock of the night. They checked to see if everyone had survived the frost and if there were any frostbite victims. Each survivor greeted the new day as a small personal victory. The sun, if it appeared, was weak and did not warm, but even its light provided psychological relief. The day seemed safer and warmer than the night, even though the temperature might not have changed. The soldiers learned to appreciate the simplest things: a ray of sunshine, an extra mug of hot tea, dry foot cloths. All of this was a source of great joy. War sharpened the perception of life to the limit, and every soldier knew that when dusk fell, it would all start again. The cold would return, and they would have to wage this exhausting, endless struggle for the right to live until the next morning. It was the hardest work of war. We see that the survival of soldiers on the winter front was a real art. It required not only endurance and courage, but also incredible ingenuity, quick wits, and mutual assistance. Every warm dugout, every homemade stove, every pair of dry socks was the result of this daily heroic struggle. These stories show us the unvarnished, everyday side of war. They remind us of the price people had to pay, not only in battle, but also in the brief moments of calm. And they teach us to appreciate the simple comforts, warmth, dryness, comfort, that we take for granted in peacetime. Which of the soldier life hacks described above did you find most ingenious? Suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on new research into the hardships and tricks of wartime.